Good afternoon, everyone. It is 1 o'clock in Melbourne and 10 a.m. in Jakarta. Thank you for joining. This is the first series in a webinar on research impact as part of the Talent Accelerator Program. A warm welcome to you who have joined us before in the Talent Accelerator Program, especially our associate fellows in the Pair Research Program, and welcome to those who have not joined us before in the Talent Accelerator Program. We're very excited to have you on board, and yeah, we're keen to see what you think of our webinar today. Today we will address the question, what is research impact? And what is the demand for impactful research is sort of what is research impact is our first topic in a series of 3 webinars. The second question will be, what is the demand for impactful research? So we will go and look at the organizations that use research to drive social change and impact, and look at what do they expect from researchers and how do they work with researchers. In the third webinar in August, we will ask the question, how do researchers plan for impact? So in that webinar, we will look at impact from a different point of view, from the viewpoint of the researcher, and ask them, how have you contributed with your research to driving social change and impact, particularly in the Indonesian context? Before we get going on that topic and I will introduce the panel, I would first like to introduce Lengua, who is here today to help us with a simultaneous translation, and perhaps they can briefly explain the system to us. Linda, welcome, and please unmute yourself and contribute.
Okay, so this is the user guide for interpretation feature in Zoom. Untuk pengguna bahasa Indonesia, jika Anda ingin mendengar terjemahan dalam bahasa Indonesia.
For Indonesian speakers, if you wish to listen to Bahasa Indonesia, please click interpretation, select Indonesian or Bahasa Indonesia in the special channel for Bahasa Indonesia. You do not need to switch channels when you're speaking. Both the speakers and interpreter will be able to hear you. Do not speak in other languages other Indonesian when you're accessing the Indonesian channel.
For English speakers, if you would like to listen in English, click interpretation, select English. You don't need to change the channel when speaking. Don't worry, your voice will be audible. When in channel, speak English. Otherwise, your speech will overlap with the interpreter. For Zoom users using mobile or cellular device, klik More untuk masuk ke pilihan berikutnya. Pilih Language Interpretation, lalu pilih Japanese untuk bahasa Indonesia.
So for Zoom users using mobile cellular devices, the button is a little bit more hidden.
For English speaker, click More, select Language Interpretation, select English for English Interpretation, click Done on top right corner. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Tasvan, for explaining the system of translation to us. Let me just briefly introduce the topic for today and the people we have in the room. So for a long time, universities were really focused kind of on themselves and on what we used to call the ivory tower. How do we make impact with other academics? And we used to look at impact through a lens of references and impact citations. But we see that that lens is shifting, and universities start to take a broader approach to impact, in particular engaging with the societies and communities that they are a part of. And especially with issues becoming more global and complex, we see that the definition of high impact is starting to shift to even a global level. So universities and researchers are asked to produce useful research, or research that people can apply and that can drive social change and impact. But that's easier said than done. So today we are going to talk about this topic, and we start off with the question, what is impact, and how do people from a different point of view look at that? And therefore we have an excellent panel today that I'm very proud of to have, and that I think we're very privileged to have, because they allow us to look at impact from different angles. So for example, we have Pak Petra Karechi, who is the head of the UN Pulse Lab in Jakarta. His world evolves around big data, and how can we use data to drive innovation, to drive social impact, and how can we use it at different instances for policy, but also for very practical purposes. We also have on the panel Bonaria Siahan. Bona is the CEO of Care Indonesia, and she is mostly focused on driving a variety of different social impacts through the philanthropy that Care Indonesia is. So she provides that unique viewpoint from a philanthropy point of view. Last, we have Professor Michael Mintram. He's a professor of public policy at Monash University, and he brings that experience of the public policy to us. In particular, he will talk about policy entrepreneurship and talk about how researchers can, what researchers can do to make their research impactful in a public policy context. So I think those three complementary views and their decades-long experience, I should say, make this a very valuable and unique panel to have today. So I'm very proud that we can present them to you. I'm also very happy to have you in the room. You present a next generation of researchers that the world kind of relies on to come up with research that can drive social impact and other forms of impact. So I'm also very happy that we can get to explore this topic with you. And I hope that you will find this session very valuable. I would like to thank you in advance for the comments that you have already put on the Open Learning website that goes with this webinar, and that you have already engaged with the materials that we have posted there for you. I would encourage you to, if you have questions for the panelists, to type those in the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. Do this at any time during the session. If a question comes up, feel free to pop it in there. We will try our best to get through as many questions as possible at the end, but hopefully we have too many questions and we'll have to get back to you with answers on those at a later time, and we'll see how that goes. The format for this session is the presenters will briefly introduce themselves, so everybody, all panelists will take about 10 minutes to introduce themselves and the impact that they are trying to achieve or that they are working on. Then we will follow that by about 25 minutes of Q&A, and then I will close the session at the very end at around 2 o'clock Melbourne time, 11 o'clock Jakarta time. Our first guest, I would like to welcome Petrarca Karechi. Pak Petra, welcome to this webinar. Please introduce yourself and the work that you're doing as the head of Pulse Lab Jakarta.
Thank you very much, Pak Martin. Good morning or good day for all of you, my friends. I hope you're all well. My name is Petrarca Karechi. It's easy to call me Petra. I am currently the head of an organization called Pulse Lab Jakarta. Prior to Pulse Lab Jakarta, I've been working for 27 years in development, starting with, first of all, working at Satya Wacana University for 2 years, then 10 years, and as a management contractor for development projects for the World Bank, 5 years at the Australian Embassy with AusAid. From AusAid, I handled a development project from Australia, which is the Knowledge Sector Initiative. And this initiative was intended to support strengthening the knowledge ecosystem for Indonesia, and in the past 2 years, since 2019, I have been at Pulse Lab Jakarta. First slide, please. I would like to also talk to you a little bit about Pulse Lab Jakarta, which is a facility for data innovation. It's jointly owned by the Indonesian government and the United Nations. Our relationship with the Indonesian government is through coordination with the Ministry of National Development Planning, or Bappenas. PLJ, or Pulse Lab Jakarta's function, is to accelerate partnerships in our analytic partnerships, applying qualitative and quantitative research. So you can see these are three main functions, which is to drive exploratory research, to facilitate partnership, and to identify new data sources and their potential for development. Next slide, please. This is our journey as a facility for data innovation and related to data. And since being established in 2013, we were using data available through social media. In our journey, you can see we started utilizing various other data sources, including telecommunication companies or telecommunication operators, CCTV data. And we also began to integrate new data or non-conventional data with traditional or conventional data. So we also started looking at the importance of bringing together new data sources with standard data such as the National Statistics Agency, for example, or BPS. And in our journey, next slide, please. We started, so one of the big questions for Pulse Lab Jakarta since being established in 2012, because it is funded by the Australian government, there would be questions. And so what has been the impact? You've produced prototypes or examples of big data utilization and also traditional data. What has been the impact of your work? And therefore, we use a particular reference called Innovation and Scaling for Impact, which was written by several researchers from Stanford. And they developed what is called impact creation logic. This is actually quite a simple framework. And in my opinion, the simpler the better, because what we're doing is quite complex already. So what I'm sharing here, logic says that we have to move in three different spaces. First, identity space, problem space, and solution space. And based on our reflection, that is Pulse Lab Jakarta has been working on solutions, seeking data utilization or data utilization. And based on that, we try to look at what problems can be handled through this new approach. But we rarely looked at identity, which organizations need this and has the mandate to overcome the issues or the problems that we identify. In this case, our structure follows this framework. So we have three units in Pulse Lab Jakarta. Data innovation is working on the solution space. We have a unit called the social system unit. And this unit mostly conducts qualitative research and mostly works on the problem space. The last unit is the partnership and advocacy unit, and it's working on identity. So therefore, in our own opinion, our approach is more balanced because we're not just looking at solutions, but rather we start from a particular issue and also looking at which institutions would handle that problem and to what extent they have the capacity to adopt the data innovations. Therefore, this is something that we do is creating this structure so that we have more impact. Next slide, please. The three types of impacts that we have is methodological impact, ecosystemic impact, and operational impact. The methodological impact for us is similar to university researchers utilizing the research approach and truly following academic norms. Therefore, our research can have the same standing as other academic research. So often our researchers write and submit their articles to international journals on data science. So that's the first impact that we achieve, which is the methodological impact. And beyond that is once we are able to observe and measure the impact on the existing ecosystem. So we start finding partnerships because methodology often utilizes data from the private sector, for example. In this case, the research process then generates partnerships with the private sector as a producer of data and the government sector. So we can say that we are starting to see ecosystemic impact. And the most difficult is to what extent there is then an operational impact. How the research that we produce or the innovations we produce is then adopted and changes the business patterns or activities in the recipient organization. One more slide. Something that we need to look at in addition to the type of impact that we wish to achieve, be that methodological, ecosystemic, or operational, we often forget to look at the scale of disruption. So based on the research produced, to what extent would that change the patterns and generate disruption in the organization that would be receiving our research recommendations? And to what extent would that be embedded into the current existing systems? Because that would limit the speed of interpretation of our research recommendation and also our understanding of the technical capacity in the recipient organization to understand and to operationalize our recommendations. And finally, to what extent are there adopters or other users within our ecosystem who can also make use of our research or our innovation. I'll stop there for now and I'll hand back to Martijn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. Some very interesting concepts there already around the types of impact that the Pulse Lab aims to make, and also I really like the concept of scale of disruption. I hope that we can get back to that in the Q&A, for example. So thank you very much. Our next guest is Bona Siahaan, the CEO of Impact Indonesia. Bona, thank you for being here, and I would like to give the screen to you, if that's okay.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon for those in Australia. So can we put up the slides, maybe? All right. So just briefly, introduction of myself, a little bit of myself. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next, okay. So my name is Vana Siahan, and I'm currently working at Yayasan Care Peduli, which is the Indonesian presence of care in Indonesia. So Care International first entered Indonesia in 1967. And in 2018, we decided to nationalize and became Yayasan Care Peduli. So this is an exciting journey as we try to actually demonstrate what being a national NGO with a global connection really means. And I think this will be relevant to our topic today, because one of the advantage of being a part of a confederation is that we have a wealth of resources, particularly from research and lessons learned gained from various experience of care in more than 100 countries. So I have been in the development field for over 30 years. I started my job many years ago in UNDP, working on poverty, social development. And as soon as the financial crisis hit in '97, I started working more on policy analysis and advocacy, particularly supporting the Indonesian reform. After that, I worked in a private bank, heading their social investment arm. I call it social investment because it used to be called CSR, but I believe that I think to make an investment sustainable, it has to be linked to the business, but also actually contribute to the welfare of communities that is affected by the business. So we call our program and turned it around to a social investment approach rather than purely philanthropical. And before I joined CARE in 2019, I headed what is called MCA Indonesia, or Millennium Challenge Account Indonesia. It was an entity that was formed by the government of Indonesia to manage a compact program of the value of $600 million. It was very time bound, 5 years, and addressed 3 programs: procurement modernization, stunting prevention, and green prosperity, which focuses on renewable energy, social forestry, peatland management, and knowledge management in environment, particularly reduction of carbon emission. So I have a background in anthropology, and then I also studied briefly in Sydney, in University of Sydney. Next. So I'm coming to this forum as a practitioner. I am not I don't have strong theoretical background. So I take what I can and what is needed and useful for the work that I'm doing and the organization that I'm attached to is doing. So first, let me start what YCP, or Yayasan Care Peduli, hopes for in terms of impact. Let me start with our vision. CARE all over the world has the vision of fighting poverty and promoting social justice. So we put gender equality and social inclusion as a very central part of all our work, whether it's in environment, whether it's in women economic empowerment, whether it's on humanitarian. These 2 features, gender equality and social inclusion, are important features. And the way we approach things is that we make sure that women and girls and other vulnerable groups, such as people with disabilities or people that are minorities, are at the center of the interventions to ensure that they're included in access, whether it's access to services, access to resources, and they can participate meaningfully, as well as make significant contribution. So not just being a standby, not just being a standbyers, but also being able to contribute meaningfully. So therefore, the kind of impact that we're looking for in all our programs is to see what is the long-term effect resulting from the series of interventions that we do under a project or a program that brings positive changes to the women, girls, and communities that we are working with that are affected by the program. So the way that we look at our impact is particularly because we put gender equality as the center of our interventions. We use what we call, I'm sorry, I will send this later if you're interested, what we call the gender marker. So gender marker actually will measure what kind of changes we want to address within a particular community related to gender equality. So we have the awareness level. This is where in many cultures, not many people or communities are aware of what equality between men and women really means. In fact, in a day and age when gender is no longer binary, this becomes even more complex. So just being aware of what equality means between different genders, that's the first level of impact that a lot of our projects actually focuses on. And then there's the much more advanced where we address relations. So this is where we actually try to include and encourage participation of these different groups, whether it's in planning and budgeting at the community level or access to resources, etc. And the final one is the most advanced impact is transformative, where we actually affect structures. So you would actually advocate for changes in regulations, sometimes laws, or even just ensuring enabling environment where community leaders, sometimes religious leaders, are actually making those changes and ensuring that the positive effect that we are aiming to seek will actually happen and supported institutionally. And I think integral to impact is how can we sustain those changes. So when we actually address a particular issue, is that we try to see what changes that we want to make, particularly for our beneficiaries, and then how do we sustain those changes? Whether do we need to change institutional setup, whether there are laws or regulation that needs to be issued in order to make sure what we have intervened can be sustained beyond the lifetime of the program. Next. So how can research help to reach impact? I think the relationship between the development community and researchers or research it goes without saying in a way, because many, for at least in my 30 years of experience, we've used research in various ways to support our program work, whether it's to help design or whether it's to help measure or to help understand a particular issue within a program. So I see three ways of how research actually will help to reach impact, particularly for the development community. It's grasp of issues. In a world where things are becoming much more complex, interrelated aspects and causal effects are much more complex, and there are uncertainties. And certainly during this COVID, we have seen a lot of unpredictable outcomes or effects, whether it's on the business or whether it's on communities, even at the household level. So there are issues that we don't fully understand. And in order for the development community or organizations like ours be able to design better programs, we need to understand those issues better. And how do we do that? It's through research, better studying of those particular issues. So I think that's one aspect that one use that I see of research in creating impact. The second one is robust methodology. As a research community, you are already a master of, robust tools in research, in methodologies, data collection, and what have you. And there is objectivity in the way you conduct your work. So this objectivity of findings and the recommendation that comes out of that research will help program decisions and designs for organizations like ours. Because, as an organization that actually implements and undertakes this kind of work, development work, we do have vested interests. So we tend to actually shape sometimes our own study. How does it support the end result that we want to see? So having a third-party researchers that have robust methodology and the objectivity to contribute to our better understanding of issues and recommendations that hopefully help us to better design the interventions is very useful. And the final one is credible measurement. We use very often also research to help us appraise, evaluate the interventions that we've invested in. This is not only to give objectivity, but it gives credibility to, if we claim that we have made an impact, that we have made positive changes, we need an external party to actually make sure that what we say is truly what is happening. And I think just a point that Martijn mentioned earlier about philanthropy. There is still, of course, philanthropy, but organizations like ours is no longer considered as philanthropical organizations purely. Why? Because resources are getting smaller and smaller, the pie is shrinking, and so we have to be credible and accountable in order to get those resources from donors and investors. And how do we do that? We have to show results. We have to give evidence-based information, which will then attract and also give confidence to those investors and donors to us. So these are the three broad areas how I see research help us in reaching impact. Next slide, please. So how can research be useful? And I'd like to borrow, if I may, Pak Petra, your impact creation logic, because I'm saying it in a different way. The three areas that you mentioned about identity space, problem space, and solution space. So I think the first one, relevance. How relevant is the research topic to the issues of the day? And this is where I would like to actually link it to the problem space. Because I think it's important. There are all kinds of topics that are of interest, but who is interested in that, which is really related to the audience part. Is there an audience for the research? Who is it for? Which is the identity space. Because we may study, the bees and the butterflies, but is there, it doesn't mean that these things are not important, but would they be of importance in terms of solving a particular issue that is happening at this point of time and that needs urgent solution? So I think it is important to actually pick your topics, relevance, and the audience, which is really, yes?
If I can interrupt you for 1 second, can I ask you to round up the sort of work towards the conclusion of the presentation? That's okay, so that we have enough time for Michael and questions. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, all right. So I think, and I think the other two is socialize and dialogue, because a lot of research sometimes do not get known. And applicability. How easy is it to understand what are the findings that can be applied and what are the implications if these recommendations are to be adopted? I think these are really what I wanted to say. I'm coming from a practitioner point of view, where I think it's important to have research to support our work, but at the same time, I think how research can suit the needs of the development community. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you much, Bona. And it's really intriguing to see already the concepts that you're introducing around how you deal with three levels of impact: awareness, relations, and transformative impact. And also, thanks for clarifying my definition of philanthropy and kind of updating that to the current day. And I really appreciate that insight there too. So thank you for doing that. I also like that you basically pointed out that it takes a village to achieve that impact, and that you cannot do it by yourself and work with many partners, and that researchers are one very important part in that whole network, which Pak Petra already called the knowledge ecosystem. So thank you for pointing that out too. I would like to continue with our next guest, Professor Michael Mintram, Professor of Public Policy at Monash University. Michael, thank you for being here this afternoon. Can I give the screen to you?
Thank you, Martin. It's a real honor to be here today. And I do feel that what I wanted today builds quite well from what Petra said, and Bona, particularly Bona, towards the end of your presentation, they're talking about research impact, because a lot of what I have to say today relates to that and how individuals can seek to make a difference. Individual researchers seeking to have policy influence in some way or other. I wonder if the slides that I have prepared for today, if the first could go up. So yes, you can see the topic there, what researchers can learn from policy entrepreneurs. Throughout my career as an academic, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how small groups of people who are very interested in making policy change, how they can make that happen. And as a consequence of that interest, I've studied the activities of these activists that I call policy entrepreneurs across a range of different countries and policy areas. And from that, I've distilled some general kind of guidelines on what I think it takes in order to have policy influence. And I want to share with you some of those things today. In terms of my current role, I work at Monash University as director of a group called Better Governance and Policy. And our reason for being is really to help researchers to increase the visibility and the influence on policy of their research, if they have an interest in doing that. So we work alongside people as kind of consultants, giving advice, suggesting things that they might do to raise the visibility of their work. And I find myself that reflecting on the work of policy entrepreneurs more broadly is quite informative. And many times when I'm giving advice to others, and also when I think about my own work and efforts to have influence. So if we could just move to the next slide. I would like to just talk briefly about the strategies of policy entrepreneurs. They very often work hard to frame what is the nature of the problem. And in doing that, they're seeking in a way to influence the narrative around policy and the structuring of problems. And again, I think this is relevant to what Petra and Bona were saying before me about organizations having influence and making sure that they've got the problem specified correctly. That leads to all sorts of questions about what kind of evidence do we gather in order to make convincing cases and so on. It also strikes me that policy entrepreneurs can benefit greatly from their networks. What I often talk about, the strength of weak ties, that is having ties out there, not people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, but that you know, and you know that you could send them an email and they'd respond. This can be very, very valuable to have networks of people out there who you can pull together quickly to draw upon for knowledge and insights, war stories, things like that, that can help you with your efforts to have policy influence. And similar to that, working with advocacy coalitions. And that doesn't mean actually building a whole new coalition yourself, but actually figuring out what other people are doing to influence policy and how you can fit with their agendas and talk with them about what they're seeking to do, putting them together. So it might be a particular issue, say, improving some aspect of, say, primary school education, for example. You might think it'd be worthwhile working with different kinds of advocates out there. It could be teachers' unions, it could be principals' unions, it could be parents' groups and researchers as well, and saying what can we do to kind of pull that group together in a coherent whole that will help to push along the kind of policy influence that we want to have. Sometimes policy entrepreneurs lead by example. That is to say, they might say, if we can create something in our own backyard that works, then that actually demonstrates the proof of the concept, what we're trying to do. And it can also be a good starting point for scaling things up. And the reason that I think this is so powerful is that often politicians and others who are in decision-making roles who may want to influence policy or can influence policy can be risk averse. They don't want to make things, make changes that might blow up and work against them. So if you can demonstrate how something works and in the process show people why it would be low risk to adopt a change, then that can be very helpful to your cause. And another thing that I think is important for policy entrepreneurship is actually thinking about scaling up change processes. And spent a bit of time thinking about this. I actually think this is one area where there's a lot of work still to be done about learning across sites and things. It's interesting with Petra with his work on UNDP. The different UN agencies are really great as clearinghouses for knowledge these days and can help to diffuse knowledge across the world very quickly. And I think we saw that with COVID during the COVID crisis. Well, it's the ongoing COVID crisis, but that I think is an important part too of what policy entrepreneurs do. If we could just move to the next slide, I wanted to briefly talk about the kind of skills that are required. And on this, I want to talk mainly about skills of an individual, although they could also be skills of a team that can really help with policy entrepreneurship. And on this, maybe the ones I'm conscious of time, maybe point out, collecting evidence is actually something, again, Bona was very clear about in her presentation, and Petra too, talking about how they and their organizations have been very strategic in the kind of evidence that they've collected in order to have impact over the years. And of course, gathering evidence is very important for making really coherent arguments. Another thing that I think is really vital for having policy influence is figuring out how to make different arguments and find ways to connect with multiple audiences. So having the same message, but telling it in different ways to different groups can be really important for building a coalition of support to make change happen. And again, related to that are the skills of networking and also negotiating. And if I could just move to the last slide now, very briefly, it seems to me those skills that I talked about are things that we can learn. We could take a course on being a good team player or take a course on negotiating. There are also attributes, and I think it's harder to, change your attributes over a weekend. But I do think that that there are things about our attributes that can be nurtured or can change over the longer term. So, for example, I think if I reflect on my own career, as my career has advanced, I've probably become more ambitious, and that's partly sort of recognizing what's possible. But I think this is true for people in general, that once people get to a certain point, they start to see other opportunities. They think, oh, okay, I could try this or I could try that. So ambition is important for making sure that if you want to have policy influence, that you'll be motivated. You'll keep pushing when often you'll get things pushed back at you, a lot of blowback. You're trying to have influence, but you're not getting anywhere. Ambition really matters. Otherwise, you just say, oh, well, I'll just give up. I'll give up and do something easier. We don't want that. A couple of other things that I'll just mention. Credibility, I think for us all talking today as researchers and people associated with think tanks or philanthropic organizations or universities, that we do by definition have a degree of credibility. If you're a PhD, you're called Dr. So-and-so or Professor so-and-so. Of course, that is a starting point. So people would say, we'll listen to this expert. But then if you start, you've got to talk to them in a way that they understand. So they not only appreciate your expertise, but they appreciate the way that you communicate with them. So credibility, again, is something you can build over time. If you're feeling like you need to be in a position that you're not in order to have influence, then you might work to get that position and then go for influence, or you might find ways to work in teams with people who do already have that credibility. And the last thing I just mentioned there is tenacity. I mean, just really keeping on going. Many people have policy influence. They didn't have influence first time around. I worked on a book a couple of years ago looking at policy successes in Australia and New Zealand. And it's amazing how many of those were things that had failed on their first or second or even third attempt before the people who supported them had policy success. So I think it's really important to recognize that and know that being tenacious and really working at things when something doesn't go the way you want, kind of analyzing it, saying what worked here, what didn't work, how can we learn from that? It's very important for keeping your own sense of purpose, but also helping others who are working with you to keep that sense of motivation and desire to keep going to make change happen. I think I'll just leave it there and we can follow up at question time.
Fantastic, Michael. Thank you very much. I think it's so enlightening to see, first of all, that as you say, as a small group and as individual researchers, that we can contribute to public policy and that research does have influence on policy, although that seems sometimes far removed from the academic research. And moreover, that we can work on our skills and develop those to become better policy entrepreneurs, as you call them. a fascinating concept in itself. Let's from here move into the questions. Again, thank you for those who have submitted questions in advance. We have about 15 minutes. I will introduce the first question. This is a question from Zani from the University of Queensland, and this is a question for Petra. Petra, Zani points out that the Pulse Lab already in the past has brought some really valuable innovation for example, growing rice or rice farming in Indonesia. She suggests that there are a lot of new technologies available, for example, satellite imagery that can be used in the production for seaweed farming. And there are probably other examples of technology that are very valuable to use, but she says also the costs of these technologies are relatively high compared to, for example, for commodities such as seaweed in Indonesia to use for individual farmers and in their practices. What is your experience in introducing such innovations to farming?
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a great question. I mean, the research that you referred to was looking at rice production and testing out a new methodology called positive deviance, why there are certain areas growing rice better, and then why are they outside of the norm? And what we found is that that actually it links also with agroclimates across the provinces, where using satellite data to identify agroclimates. The issue is not necessarily, I mean, our government actually has a lot of funding available, and I think it's more about convincing the economic worth of that, and so adding economic what do you call it, considerations or calculations into this, why it makes good sense for the government to invest in these technologies. And that's where we actually have fallen short, where we need to be able to that the economic argument around some of the research and technologies. But yeah, so we haven't been very successful in introducing that aspect, although but I feel also sometimes the issue is around coordination between different ministries as well, and the willingness to share data across ministries. So and unfortunately that impacts on the farmer. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but it's still an issue. Basically, it's still an issue that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. I have a second question here for Bona. I have a question from Dilla. Dilla explains, she says, how can we make an impact to effectively answer the question, what women want, the hashtag what women want. And she says there are so many different groups of women. And I think, Bona, you already pointed that out as well, that we have a non-binary spectrum of genders, for example. How do you measure that impact, and how do you can you sort of generalize the impact that you make with one particular group of women to can you apply that to all women is I think Dilla's question. I hope that I put that right, Dilla.
Okay, so I think the universal principle is the equality in access, equality to participation and contribution. So I think that is the general principle. Whatever the status or situation the women it may be in. So I think to make an impact, because I think it really matters what level of impact are we talking about or we seek to make, because it can be at the household level, it can be across communities, it can also be at a state level, especially if we talk about policy changes, etc. So I think it really depends on what do we aim to actually address, at what level are we seeking to make that changes, because that would also affect the kind of, I think I read the question there, would it matter if we have a smaller sample or should we have a larger sample? would that represent women across, as you say, you know, there are women in Eastern Indonesia and Western Indonesia, there are the urban and rural women, and they all have different kind of features. Now, so the issues that may be faced may have some similarities, but there may be specifics. So depending on your scope of work or the intervention that you want to make, that will determine whether your sample is a large one or a small one, and it would be across different kind of locations or just in one location. And I can say this because, you know, CARE is also a small organization. It's not that big. So some of our women empowerment projects actually focuses only on 3 districts in one province. Would that represent women across Indonesia? Not necessarily so, but we take the lessons learned from one particular program to see whether there are relevances when we want to cut, you know, we want to change location or try to replicate that. What are the replicable elements of that particular program that we can seek to apply in the other location? And that would need what? Research or study. So I hope I have answered that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bona, for both addressing that from a research point of view as well as CARE's point of view, and how do you translate that impact to different groups. Petra, in the meantime, published a link in the chat that portrays a similar qualitative approach to what Bona was just talking about. I have a question from Michael, and this is a question from Anda. Anda says, she's basically addressing the topic of the ivory tower that I briefly touched upon in the beginning. And she says that we are, as academics, often focused on publishing in high impact academic journals. And she's basically asking the question, is this still relevant to make our research more beneficial to the community? Should we as academics be focusing on high impact journals, or should we focus on becoming policy entrepreneurs or anything else, Michael?
Thanks for the question. I love that question, and it's actually one that we talk a lot about at Monash University. And I take a bit of an old school view on this, actually, in the sense that I think that part of the credibility of researchers based in universities having impact is in fact their academic status. So to put it in the crudest terms, someone who has just got their PhD, who's in a fairly junior position, maybe a relatively precarious position in a university, is not going to have the same credentials, track record, or as a result credibility with stakeholders as someone who's been toiling in the fields of a particular research area for a while and has worked their way up through the academic ranks. So one of the things that I've been saying at the university is for early career researchers, work as hard as you can to build up your traditional academic credentials, move up the hierarchy, try to get yourself positioned as an associate professor or a professor, and then start doing a bit of the more move towards influence. And I know some people disagree with me on that because they're saying, hey, you don't want to, waste half your life doing all this academic stuff before you have impact. But look, I think there's also space for having balance here. So in terms of working as a researcher in teams, you might be focusing on, publishing in high quality journals for some of your stuff, doing a little bit of impact work, contract work, maybe working with a senior colleague in other areas. So I don't see a trade-off between the two. But I would say that I think those who say, forget about all the traditional academic stuff, I'm just going to go for impact, I actually think that that's a very short-term route to take. And I think it can also ultimately lead to limited impact, and that you do actually need to have the scholarly credentials. Plus, by being seen by your academic colleagues as having, stature as a well-regarded, well-published academic, they're more likely to come on board with you when you want to build a team of people who are going to tackle a very applied project. So that's the way I'm thinking about it at the moment. I don't want to suggest it's a definitive position, but that's where I think you can kind of balance off the academic career, credibility, and impact.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Michael. That's a very comprehensive answer. I think also from just preaching from the Australia-Indonesia Center, I think collaboration is a theme that seems to come up very much across the three presenters today. And I think working with other people who can take different parts of that value chain is a very valuable approach to achieving that impact. I've got one last question for all three of you. And I think this is an interesting one. Let me look. Ganja says it is easy to measure scientific publication impact. To some extent, it's easy to measure environmental impact and perhaps even industrial or commercial impact. But how can we correctly quantify the social impact of our research results and implementation? I think perhaps I can, whoever would like to respond to this question, I think it's a question many people are working with at the moment.
I can have a go.
Bona, please, thank you.
Okay, so I think you're right. I think especially, and I do believe that, all these elements are interrelated, even industrial development have social impact as well on, surrounding communities or people in general. So the way that CARE works, and I think if you have time, please do visit the CARE International website. I'll type it in because we have a wealth of resources in terms of toolkits. So particularly in gender, there are global indicators. So wherever CARE works, we actually have global indicators in the 6 areas that we're working in, whether it's in climate justice, women economic empowerment, rights to food, health, and what have you. And these are actually related to the social impact that we want to make in those areas. And there are indicators, but those are quantifiable, of course. But to me, I think, and we also believe that numbers are not enough. You need to tell the stories behind those numbers. What does it mean if you say 100 women are able to access water? What does that mean for that women? It means they don't have to go to the river and walk 2 kilometers away every day to get that water. It relieves their burden. So I think you have to combine still those quantitative data with the story behind the data. So selecting your indicators when you actually want to measure social impact is going to be very important in that sense.
Fantastic. Thanks. Thank you, Bona. One more quick response, Petra or Michael, if you have any insights on this question, please go ahead. Petra?
Sure, yeah, it's a good question, but one that most development projects have to be able to answer. And it just comes back down to what the project was, what the purpose of the research was. So and then being able to find the relevant indicators towards being able to measure the impact of that work. So it could be big data, it could be used by qualitative research through interviews or direct surveys. So there's a host of approaches, as Ibu Bona said, and a host of references around measuring impact on that level.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Petra. Michael?
Yes, I think those are very helpful responses. One thing that struck me is that for researchers based in universities, actually working to collect data, to build dashboards, to show progress in areas can be a really, really valuable contribution from researchers, particularly helping advocates who maybe don't have as much time to be able to collect data systematically. But, and it's also an area where this is where that kind of question that came up before about the balance between academic stuff versus academic impact versus sort of real world impact can be brought together, because you could publish articles using those indicators that you've been gathering and building that new data set. You could actually use that for research purposes, but you could also use it to inform advocacy. So I think that this is a space where academics based in universities can do a lot to help advocacy and policy influence.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you all three, Petra, Bona, and Michael, for joining us today and for sharing your valuable insights and incredible work with us that you are doing. I found it really insightful for the fact that you were able to show us the different types of impact that you and your organizations are trying to make, or Michael for showing us how academics can contribute to policy change. I think in the next webinar, we will try and make the link to see, okay, how can now researchers help more concretely in trying to help organizations like yours achieve their impact missions, and try and see what researchers actually want and how you work with organizations, because I think that was another central theme that stood out to me was collaboration, and part of being a knowledge ecosystem. And in the next webinar, we'll try to more pinpoint accurately. Now we know what impact is, what is the role of the researcher in achieving that. So thank you everybody for joining us today. As we exit the meeting, you will be asked to fill out a survey. We would really appreciate if you would take the time to fill that out. I would also encourage all the participants in the webinar to go back to our Open Learning website, go back to the webinar one, and look at, if you have already done so, to look at the resources that are available there. I will make sure to post the presentations from the presenters there as well, so you can go through those at your own pace, and to leave some comments there and share some of the takeaways from this session with each other. And possibly if you have resources that you would like to share around impact, please do that there as well. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time. We will have our second webinar late June, and our third webinar in August. So thank you very much everybody for attending. It was a great pleasure having you. And again, thank you to our panel for being here today.